The goal of analyzing the historical context of a biblical book is to develop the skill of paying attention to that historical setting of the author's original messages, and then to know how to go about doing this historical work. Some examples that might set the table for us on this one. It's really helpful to know when studying the book of Ruth that Moab is an arch enemy of Israel during this time. This heightens the potency of the author's routine reference to Ruth the Moabite. So even Ruth the Moabite is brought into the people of God and, in fact, into the line of David at the end of that book. Another example are the Roman centurions in the New Testament. If you were only to know about Roman centurions from the New Testament, you would think they're the good guys in the story, because they show up as good guys in the story. Matthew chapter 8, a Roman centurion comes and has great faith asking for healing for one of his servants. And the Roman centurion at the cross rightly says, this was the Son of God. And Cornelius, the Roman centurion, who's a very pious man in the book of Acts. But these stories work best when we understand that these are the bad guys in this story. We would expect them to be loyal to Rome and not to Jesus or to the Christian faith, and they prove us wrong. So this power of the story comes when we realize that these are supposed to be the bad guys, but they turn out to be some of the good guys. One of my favorite examples comes from Amos 4:4, where the prophet says, "Go to Bethel and sin." Prophet speaking on behalf of God says that powerful statement, especially for one who works at Bethel Seminary. And what this shows me is that we always have to do historical work, because there is no such thing as context-less interpretation. We will put some sort of backdrop behind a text we're reading to make sense of it. And in this case, we could put Bethel Seminary, Bethel University, behind this text, "Go to Bethel and sin," but it wouldn't be the right backdrop. Instead, we should look to the place of Bethel, or Bethel, in the northern country of Israel during the time of Amos, where there was a shrine to Israel's God, where people were going there to make sacrifices. And yet, Amos has a big critique of the people. Not that they're going to make sacrifices and to worship, but that they're ignoring justice and mercy toward one another. So he says, "Go to Bethel and sin." Something like if I would say to you today, "Go to your church sanctuary and sin." It's meant to shock them out of their complacency, to say, just going through the practice of worship will not honor God if we are ignoring God's commands in all of our lives. When we're thinking about doing this book-level historical analysis, paying attention to historical analysis, we can do so at the book level. And here it's often helpful to ask questions of who is the author? Who are the audience? What was the date it was written? What are the purposes of the book? So author, audience, date, purpose is one way to get at this larger question of book-level historical analysis. Let's take the example of the book of Philippians. And we can answer these questions for Philippians, and we can often be helped by looking at a commentary or a Bible handbook, something like that, to help us understand the answers to these historical questions. Paul is the author, writing in prison, and the audience is the Philippian house churches, one or more house churches, in the Roman colony of Philippi, which is in Greece, but it is a Roman colony during the time of Paul's writing. The date is probably the early 60s, especially if Paul is imprisoned in Rome. And there's usually long discussions of this in commentaries. And then the purposes. And these are things we can get both from inside the book and primarily from inside the book, but also from reading commentaries to help us understand this bigger picture. Some of the purposes of Philippians: Paul wants to assure the Philippians that he and the gospel are really all right, even though Paul's imprisoned. Both are going to be all right in the end. Also, he wants to introduce the return of Epaphroditus, one of their members who had come to help Paul in his imprisonment. And he's sending Epaphroditus back to the church, chapter 2:25, and he's asking the church to welcome him back. Paul's addressing some amount of disunity in the fellowship, chapter 2, chapter 4, And he also, at the end of chapter 4, at the very end of the letter, thanks the church for their gift to him that was sent through Epaphroditus. So getting a picture of the whole of the book in terms of the historical setting can really help us read the book well. And then there will be, in the passage we are studying, there will often be subjects needing more attention that kind of call out for some historical study. So when we think of passage-level historical analysis, here we want to identify areas where historical analysis seems to be needed. And you might just read through the passage and jot down some ideas. This seems to need a little bit more analysis. Second, prioritize these for interpretation. Which of these are most important? Because you might have 4 or 5 things you'd like to research, and you might only have time to research a couple of them. So prioritize them, which are most important for interpretation. And then spend some time researching 1 or more areas. Talk about what that looks like in a moment. And then listen to the text with this new information in mind. What have you learned from your historical study? If we were to look at Philippians 3, 12 through 21, which is a passage at the end of chapter 3 where Paul's talking about his eschatological mindset looking forward toward resurrection, there might be a few different areas where historical analysis is needed. The first one that popped up for me is in verse 17, when Paul references a group of people who are examples. He says, keep your eyes on those who live as we do, and that we pops out. Who might that be about? Another question comes in verses 18 through 19, where Paul talks about some who seem to have been Christians, for as I've told you often before, and I'll tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. So who are these enemies of the cross? He goes on to talk about them in verse 19. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, their glory is in their shame, their mind is set on earthly things. So I would want to look at a commentary or another tool that might help me understand that group better. And then finally, in verses 20 and 21, we hear about Paul's anticipation of Jesus' return, at which time he will transform our lowly bodies so they'll be like his glorious body. What was Paul's view? What was the Jewish view of resurrection or bodily resurrection, which it seems to be talked about here? So as I prioritize those, especially given that chapter 3, verse 11 already talked about resurrection, I think I need to know more about that. So Jewish views of bodily resurrection would be kind of high on my list. And then those positive examples, I can quickly see from reading the whole book that Paul has pointed to himself, but also Timothy and Epaphroditus as examples, and Christ is the ultimate example, and those are in chapter 2. Those positive examples might be exactly what he's referring to with the we. So I might not need to go a whole lot farther for that question. And then finally, enemies of the cross, and those descriptions in verse 19. Who are these folks? Any commentary will spend some time talking about who these people are. If there's a particular group that commentator has in mind, or if it's a more general look, you can see that in the discussion. So as you research some areas, I would also encourage you to be alert for new areas, maybe something that you weren't paying attention to that you hear a lot of historical discussion about. So you might also want to be on lookout for that. So I've highlighted a couple of things to pay attention to: Jewish views of bodily resurrection and who are these enemies of the cross. And the places I go to look for that information, commentaries in the text of the commentary will discuss those kinds of historical issues, especially exegetical commentaries, and then Bible background commentaries, which are written just for these kinds of questions. And then a background dictionary. I've mentioned here the Dictionary of New Testament Background. Those kinds of resources can also be helpful. As you're doing this research work, you might also find a new area that you weren't expecting. For example, in Philippians 3:20, we have the language of citizenship that shows up, politeuma, also in 127, the verb form. And this citizenship is really an interesting term for Paul to use when writing to the Philippians who live in a Roman colony. What I learned from reading the commentaries, this is not necessarily the case that all of the Philippian believers are Roman citizens. It's not the case. Maybe less than half are. But the value of Roman citizenship is really high. It's prized, and Roman values sort of pervade Philippi during this time. That's important historical information that can help me with this passage, but maybe with some other passages as well in Philippians. So as we listen to the text with this new information in mind, we can note that Paul talks about his example and the example of these others. And in my mind's eye now, I think about Timothy and Epaphroditus when I hear, just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do. So I think back to chapter 2 and Christ as the ultimate example, and Timothy and Epaphroditus, and then Paul himself. Verse 18, for as I have often told you before and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, their glory is in their shame, their mind is set on earthly things. In my understanding, this is sort of a general picture of any believer who has turned away from this eschatological mindset, this looking ahead toward final resurrection and all that Christ has for us, and is instead kind of capitulated to just thinking about the current reality and dealing with life only in the day-to-day. And Paul says they become an enemy of the cross, not an enemy of Christ, but enemy of the cross. And commentators will point out here the importance of hearing the themes in Philippians of believers needing to live into a cross-like or a cruciform-like way of living. And those who don't are in this category for Paul, of those who are now enemies of any kind of suffering or of staying true to Christ in troubling times. So that picture of the enemy of the cross gets fleshed out as we do some historical work. And then finally, the vision in verse 21 of Christ transforming our lowly bodies so they will be like his glorious body. This resurrection vision, in Jewish thought, it's that final day when all the faithful will be raised to life to be with God. And in the Christian view, it's just taken over, and it's now Christ who will raise the faithful and will give them that glorious new resurrection body like his resurrection body, because Christ's resurrection has already happened, and we still await that final day resurrection. So as we think about historical analysis, we can very much be helped by doing some of this historical legwork, using some of the sources like commentaries and Bible background commentaries, and learning the rich historical grounding that comes in many of the passages that we're studying.